So if today has not been interesting enough yet, you haven't learned enough, this last panel is going to be critical conversation that we all know is right on us, very topical about the issues of innovation and integrity, and how do we balance that? So to open up, I bring in our representative from Microsoft, and who has helped to make this whole event possible. So Marlene, thank you very much.
So thanks, John, and thanks, Catherine, for bringing this really amazing conversation together. I've been really purposely putting my phone aside today and just really trying to listen, because I think there's always things that we can learn. And I think the first thing that I wanted to talk about today is, I'm sure everyone looks at the list of sponsors and goes, Microsoft? Why is Microsoft here? And I think that this is a core question that we have to be talking about today. One is, we're one of the largest tech companies in the world. We're one of the largest companies in the world. Democracy is at the foundation of good business. Yes, we're here because it's our responsibility as one of those large corporate entities that's driving, GDP growth and business. But having a strong democracy is integral to having strong business as well. And so I encourage everyone today that when you're thinking about this issue, to think of it from a multifaceted way, that these issues are so complex that they can't be solved by government, by civil society, and academia alone. They have to also include industry as part of that conversation. And I encourage that it's not just the tech industry that has to be part of that conversation. When we have strong and secure democracies, businesses can thrive in a stable environment. So at Microsoft, we've taken this responsibility very to heart. I think it was really after the 2016 election, I think we dug in pretty deeply with what we call a democracy forward, or now one time it was called the Defending Democracy team. And this mandate has expanded over the years. My colleague Dave's going to speak a bit to that. But I think some of these things that we've been working on, particularly this past spring in Munich, there was a tech accord signed by 24 companies on the deceptive use of AI in electoral campaigns. And this was a set of voluntary commitments that these 24 companies, including some of the largest tech companies in the world, made to say, this is what we're going to do in order to address these issues. I think that this is kind of integral, and I think the lead-in to the conversation that we're going to have today. And with that, I know that I feel like we've tested and teased this conversation, because when we say emerging tech, I think the real thing that we're saying is artificial intelligence, and how does that impact our electoral systems. So with that, I know I'm very much looking forward to this conversation today. Thank you for having us. And I leave you with one challenge, and what I started with, which, what is the role for industry and business? I don't think there's many of us in this room today. Why is that? And how can we be engaged, and what should we be doing in order to protect our electoral processes and our democracy as a whole? So.
Thank you. So it is my pleasure today to moderate this panel, provide some context. My name is Holly Ann Garnett. I'm the class of 1965 professor in leadership at the Royal Military College of Canada. And one of the big things that I work on is the Electoral Integrity Project, which I co-direct. And we've been tracking the quality of elections for about 12 years now, all over the globe, looking at everything through the electoral cycle. So from the pre-electoral period, designing laws, registering voters, through the campaign, election day, and its aftermath. And in those 12 years of data, things have fundamentally changed in how we run elections here in Canada, but then also around the globe. And we've noticed that a large part of that fundamental change has been in part due to changes in new technologies entering the electoral sphere, both within the use by electoral administrators in the technical aspect of administrating and running an election, but then also within the campaign space. So how we inform, how we deliberate, and how even records are being kept by political parties for donors and to attract voters. So things have changed fundamentally. And when it comes down to it, I would propose for perhaps 3 major changes that have been brought in by the digital in the electoral sphere. The first is that digital information is much more malleable and much easier to replicate, which can be a really fantastic thing. You can get things out to so many more people, but it also means when it's such low-cost ability to replicate that information or those media, it can also be editable and really easy to change. So that existence of things in digital format has fundamentally altered elections. The second is the change in pace. So the rapid acceleration of pace in communications in elections. Many aspects of the electoral process happen now at such a high speed. You can look up your registration record right away online with the click of a button. All it takes is a couple minutes. You can see information. The debates can be happening in real time. And so that acceleration has also fundamentally changed things for elections. And the third, I would say, is the expansion of the types of actors involved in elections. I don't think we would have been talking before tech as much about overseas actors because they wouldn't have as much access to domestic elections. But the reality is that an overseas actor perhaps has just as much access into our elections as anyone here sitting in this room who are domestic. Also, the types of people who can have a wide audience. A celebrity can give out a tweet, and that can alter how we are debating and how we are discussing these issues in elections. So those 3 big changes brought by tech, the existence of the digital, the acceleration of the pace, and the introduction of new actors, are things that we really want to start talking about today. And the question we're interested in talking about is how these changes have influenced the quality of elections, but also public trust in elections and electoral integrity. And if there have been changes, which there have been, what do we do about it? What do we do about it when it starts influencing in a negative light the quality of elections? And so to give a bit of context, I was asked to kind of give some of the broader overview. What I'd like to propose to get us started is kind of a framework of how the Electoral Integrity Project, at least, understands how we evaluate the quality of elections. So what should we be thinking about if we want elections to actually fulfill the job of serving democracy like we expect it to? And so the first is that we want to see equality of contestation. So that means everybody and every viewpoint can run as a candidate, so have both the legal ability to do so, but then also have an actual ability to compete and contest. And in some ways, technology has actually made that easier. Emerging candidates can more quickly gather like-minded supporters through digital media, and you could attract a larger cross-section of more diverse views and viewpoints. But at the same time, we've also seen technology push people out of the race, especially due to hate speech, online harm, and people not wanting to enter the political arena simply because of the threats that exist now because of social media. It also makes it much harder to track and prosecute these sorts of instances that might be pushing people out of the race. The second thing we want for a fair process is a fair, deliberative environment. And elections are really one of those few times that we are all engaging in a policy debate as a country about where we want our country to go. It doesn't happen all that often that we're engaged in one single unified policy debate. And technology has allowed us to bring that debate real time. And not just that everyone can hear different viewpoints, but that everyone can also express them through social media, for example. However, there are questions now about whether citizens are actually deliberating real information. You know, we've always had instances where there has been false and misleading information or negative campaigning or attacking in campaigns. But now, I think the fundamental question that's changed is, are people deliberating using accurate information? And part of this is also that the rapid pace of that information means that these discussions sometimes have become too quick to even be really meaningful. We move on to the next thing and the next thing, and this moment of elections where we're all debating and discussing the future of our country ceases to really be a moment and becomes really quick sound bites and quick seconds. The third thing we want elections to do is we want there to be equality of participation. So that's really what it sounds like. Everyone can vote, everyone can participate. And we see that citizens have, because of technology, access to information and tools to inform and facilitate their participation using technology. At the municipal level, maybe that's online voting. It might be new forms of assistance that they can use at the ballot boxes. But this also might be masking a growing digital divide in terms of access, but also ability to use the tools, especially as we move everything into a digital space. A lot of research has found that convenience measures actually just assist those who are most likely to be voting anyway and not actually attracting new people into the political process. So how does tech function into that? And the fourth thing we want to see elections have is a clear process of adjudication that we can have confidence in. So when things go wrong, we know what the process is to deal with it. And technology around the world has made some really important strides in dealing with this issue. Citizen monitors equipped with a smartphone can be tracking and monitoring and bringing to light issues with electoral integrity wherever they happen to be. You can look up donation records online. You can look up what the Commissioner of Canada elections, what sort of cases they're hearing online. You can have access to this sort of information so much easier, which allows for a greater amount of transparency. But with so much information, this narrative also becomes confused and can also become manipulated by those seeking to influence elections, all of which has brought some evidence of lower trust in elections at the same time, and also less willingness around the globe to accept election results because you're not entirely sure if what you're reading and what actually happened is true or not. So with these fundamental changes in mind, so this rise of the digital, the rapid speed, the new actors involved, and these dimensions of electoral integrity, where does that put us then in Canada, an established democracy? So where are our major challenges? Where are our major opportunities? Where can we learn from other countries? And where are we headed in this next era of cyber elections, especially with the emergence of other technologies that we're just starting to talk about now? So today we have guests from two sectors, so one from industry and one from government, which I think will make for a really interesting discussion about different rules, about different actors involved in this space. So I'll introduce them both and then give them each an opportunity to make some opening remarks. So Dave Leichtman is the Director of Corporate Civic Responsibility at Microsoft as part of the company's Democracy Forward program. He runs civic engagement efforts and works with electoral officials worldwide to address tech, security, and AI needs. Dave also leads the company's internal US and international election strategy. So he's coming to us from industry and has some really interesting insights from there. And then from government, we have Joshua Kilberg, who leads the nation-state cyber threat assessment program at the Canadian Cyber Centre. And he has more than a decade of experience in national security issues. So what I'll do is I'll give each of you about 5 minutes or so, and then we can continue the conversation in a few moments. So Dave, would you like to go first?
Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, okay. Hi. As Holly said, Dave Leichtman. I'm the Director of Corporate Civic Responsibility at Microsoft. That sounds like a really lofty title. It basically means I run civic engagement in global elections, just for a little context. We often, it's silly. When we talk industry, a lot of times we have a tendency to be like, and here's the org chart at my company. But I actually think it's important to understand my group, Democracy Forward, that Marlene mentioned, we sit in corporate social responsibility, which is unique among companies. If you look at the other companies that are our peers in this space, they tend to treat at least the democracy work that they do as more of a sales motion or a marketing motion. They're actually working with the electoral commissions, keep you secure, yes, but also to sell you things. Do I want to sell you things? Sure, but it's not my job, and I love that. So I just get to come to things like this and talk and say cool things. My group, more largely, is called Tech for Fundamental Rights. So we cover human rights, accessibility, responsible business practices. So I think I have a really cool job. I really love it, and I get to talk about democracy with cool folks. And I represent the company to most of the electoral commissions worldwide. So if you've never talked to me and you're in this room and you represent Provincial or Elections Canada, let's talk afterwards because I want to help you. Everything I do is free, which is fun. Yeah, so to set the stage for what we're talking about, Marlene mentioned the tech accord and AI, and that's clearly on everyone's mind. I get that. But let's drop back and rehash a little bit of what Holly said, because I think it's absolutely critical to understand when we have a conversation about electoral trust, what are we fundamentally talking about, and how are we framing the conversation? Question, this is a lecture hall with desks, and so what is the purpose of an election? Anyone? There's one answer, and you will be graded. One correct answer. No one's going to answer. Okay, fine. I'll just give it to you. The purpose of an election is to get everybody to agree on the results of an election afterward, or maybe not, even to just agree on the moving forward path after an election. That can even look like throwing out the election and creating a power-sharing government, whatever it takes to get people to agree that the government represents them. An election is a way to achieve that, right? So when we talk about electoral trust, it's important to think, we have these conversations about cybersecurity, we have these conversations about information integrity, accessibility, access to voting. Those all accrue to electoral trust, right? Those are all different ways that society can build trust in an election. Cybersecurity is one of those. And I think, especially, Alex, you know this, like in the US, we've completely over-indexed on cybersecurity to a ridiculous extent, especially since 2016 and the hacks against the DNC and all of that, to the point where it's hard to talk about anything else. And I guess, fortunately, now we're talking foreign influence operations as another factor of eroding electoral trust. So we've managed to get away from cybersecurity a little bit, but we talk about hybrid threats now. So the two of them together, cybersecurity and influence operations, result in a hybrid threat to trust and democracy. But when we're talking about these things, when we're talking about emerging tech and how it influences elections, it's important to think about it through that lens, right? Cybersecurity, accessibility, they don't have to be trade-offs. They just need to, you have to think about them in terms of how are these things accruing to how society views the outcome of an election. I hold this up because in 2020, the Cybersecurity and, what is it called? Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, which is very redundant, in the US, CISA, they are part of Department of Homeland Security, and they're responsible for elections cybersecurity. They said 2020 was the most secure election in the history of the United States. And they said it was the best election in the history of the United States. Okay, but like when half of Americans don't believe that the election was fairly decided, that's an abject failure, right? You failed to establish trust in the election. And so I think it's really important when we talk about these emerging technologies that we view it in that lens. Like, what is the overall trust accrual to the election?
Josh, would you like to provide some opening remarks as well?
Sure. Thanks very much. Thanks to Kat, who I don't see, but thanks to everyone organizing the conference. I've organized these before, and I know that it's a real pain. So if you see a smile on their face, it's probably fake, but thank you. As Holly Ann mentioned, I work at the Cyber Center. Just very quickly, the Cyber Center is a part of the Communications Security Establishment, which is the agency that you've never heard of. We've been around for 80 years, gathering foreign intelligence and protecting government communications since the Second World War. The Cyber Center itself is only 6 years old, but we have a 80-year history of protecting communications. My team represents a small part of the Cyber Center, but it is probably, my team is probably the most familiar to you because we write the Cyber Threats to Democratic Process, which are those pieces that come out on the website. We've written 4, and I thought I would just maybe walk you through very quickly how we view, how Cyber Center views protecting elections, because there's sort of like 2 bands to this. So the first one is cybersecurity relating to the voting system itself. Monsieur Perrault was here earlier today. I'm not sure if oh, there you are, sir. We have, Cyber Center and Elections Canada have an unbelievably positive and collaborative working relationship, and we have had for many years. Most of the work that is done is at a very technical level, which is protecting Elections Canada's systems. And when you talk about voting, there's a term that I'm just going to introduce to you, which is very easy because I have young kids, and my analogy comes from those young kids. So someone draws a house, right? And so there's a triangle, and then there's a square. The concept that I want to explain to you is threat surface. When we talk about technology in voting systems or technology in the democratic process, it's all about threat surface, and it's about accepting risk. We will never get to zero risk, right? If you want to use technology to do anything, there's some sort of risk that is involved. So we draw our house, and then we say, well, we need a door in order to get in. That is now one way to get into that house. Well, we need windows, and we need a back door, and we need a skylight. These are all creating holes in the surface, which makes the system better, but introduces elements of risk and broadens the threat surface. So this is something that we do as our core business, which is protecting Government of Canada systems, and we offer advice and guidance. There's a bunch of resources on our website about that as well. The second part, when we think about threats to elections, it's on the information system side, or the information environment side, I should say. And that is what leads us to technology. So that's what leads us to artificial intelligence. In 2017, when we wrote the first Cyber Threats to Democratic Process, we put together a data set of all national level elections around the world for 20 years or something like that, with all of the information that we had, so it's classified. And one of the things that we measured of cyber threats to elections around the world was disinformation. When we published our most recent report in November of last year, we dropped that observation in our coding because it's ubiquitous. Every single election that we saw around the entire world in the last 2 years had evidence of disinformation campaigns. So it is like water and breathing. It is everywhere. And that is the environment in which we find ourselves. We've been writing about and studying deep fakes since 2017. But the point that I will leave with you, and then we can get into the questions, is we are currently in the middle of a paradigm shift where generative AI is currently, as we speak, iterating and evolving and changing the entire information ecosystem. So we have this sliver of activity that we're talking about specifically today, voting and the democratic process. But generative AI is placing constraints on us from a cybersecurity perspective, and it is changing our understanding of information and where it comes from. So it's infinitely fascinating, but this is a wicked problem. This is not, I've been so lucky to be here today and listen to everyone saying, here's everything that's wrong, and I don't have an answer for it. Here's everything's wrong, and I don't have an answer for it. Because it's such a difficult problem, and we're living through it right now. So I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to be here with you, and I'll hand it back to Holly Ann. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So I have a few things I want to follow up on just from your introductory remarks. And I'll start with something you'd mentioned, because I love the image of the house, and then you add doors, and there's going to be more threats there. And so that's the thing with tech and elections, right, is that in one sense, there are so many opportunities. I don't think there's any EMB today who would say, let's go back to only paper records ever, like that's just not the reality. And yet at the same time, we do know what the vulnerabilities are. So in your line of work, I'll ask you first, Josh, in like the government side of things, and then you, David, from the industry side of things. How do you go about making that negotiation between the opportunities that tech provides and the threats that we see and tend to focus a lot on?
It's such a simple question, and it's such a difficult answer because at an intelligence agency where I work, we offer advice and we offer, what we think is, information that can help the policymaker make their decision. But it's not in our line of work to tell the policymaker what decisions to make. And so any risk can be mitigated. The question is to what degree does the user or does the system owner, what degree of risk are they willing to accept? And so one of the really positive things I'm reminded of in 2017 when, this was January, right after Donald Trump was elected, just before he was sworn in, the Prime Minister tasked CSE, and my team got the call to write a report about threats to the democratic process in Canada. And that was the first time I met Monsieur Perrault's colleagues. They came into the building, and so we had this really productive chat, and then we gave them a tour of the building. We showed them the data center, and one of the Election Canada executives said, well, all we have is a warehouse with all of the election results going back to Confederation. And they said that as a joke, and I was like, can I please go and see that? Like, I totally was. Still no invite, sir, by the way. But there is a sort of juxtaposition between the amazing work that the electoral management bodies do in trying to evolve that, and they have more priorities than simply cybersecurity. I'm a one-trick pony. I'm here to talk to you about cybersecurity, and so the degree to which elections are use technology, we encourage them we can work with them. Certainly if they're the federal government, we work directly with them, and we work indirectly with other bodies through our publications that are on the website.
And so, Dave, you would have a very different terms of reference in terms of what is within your scope and what's not. So can you explain how that calculus happens for you guys?
Sure, yeah. I actually think it's a really interesting, just paradigm shift question generally, right? My boss, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, he has a book called Tools and Weapons. I'm not saying you should buy it, but I edited a chapter, so. Any transformational technology that creates a societal shift like AI is right now, like social media did before and the internet before that, can be used as a tool or a weapon, right? I mean, we've seen that back to the beginning of civilization. That's been true. The printing press. So we know this, so let's not repeat our mistakes, right? We have an opportunity. We utterly failed as a society to regulate social media. We utterly failed. The entire world did a bad job. And the result is the internet is a dumpster fire, right? I mean, we talk about, I've been talking to some researchers at Clemson in South Carolina about doing research with folks. What happens when you give people in Ghana who have never had access to the internet, and they're like 40 years old, all they do is read memes and conspiracy theories. They become conspiracy theorists almost instantly. And that's because the internet is garbage. Well, we have an opportunity now, it's true. We have an opportunity now with artificial intelligence to do the right thing up front, right? And I think, I'm proud of Microsoft, and honestly, I think big tech writ large has done a good job of saying, look, we're gonna follow responsible AI frameworks, we're gonna self-regulate around these things, and I'm sure there's plenty of you in the room, there's a lot of academic muscle in here that'll say, that's not enough. Fine, regulate us, right? I mean, that's fair. We are asking for it, but I think also wanting to have a say in it, these responsible AI frameworks are positive. They are a benefit. We want to follow them because we want to do right by society. We want this technology to be used as a tool and not a weapon. And so, there's lots that goes into that. That's why that Marlene mentioned, we have a voluntary tech accord that we all agreed to in Munich in February, and that's around saying, look, if we see synthetic media that we think is impacting an election, we're all going to act on it. We're all going to act on it immediately. We're going to be transparent about how we're acting on it, and we're going to take it seriously. And I think that's important.
That leads into something that wasn't exactly on the list of questions, but I'm going to ask anyway, because we're getting into this issue of AI, and we have the second opportunity now to regulate it. And what I hear is, well, we're public servants. We just provide, some information. We're not government, so it's not our responsibility, of course, to. So whose responsibility is it?
Everybody's. Can I say that? I mean, it's serious. The public-private partnership concept exists for a reason, right? There is no one entity that can solve a societal issue. All of society has to solve it. And these are fundamental, when we have technologies that fundamentally shift how society functions, they are all of society problems. It's academia, it's business, it's government, it's, the nonprofit sector, all working together. Like, we have to work together.
Did you want to add something there?
Sure. I'll say, just to foot stomp what Dave is saying, whoever is the professors in the room interested in your reflections on ChatGPT, generative AI, and your evaluation methods. In every sector of society, we are seeing things being fundamentally changed by ChatGPT, and the speed and power of this. It's been a year and a bit since ChatGPT was sort of adopted by everyone, and the evolution is in months, not in years. And so I think institutions are actually doing a pretty good job in catching up, but it's not at the speed of light, and government certainly doesn't operate at the speed of light, and I can attest to that. So there's, if I offer one optimistic point today, it is that people are worried about it and they're thinking about it, and that is useful because we will get there at some point. The question is do we want to repeat social media not being regulated and the negative externalities that has had on society with ChatGPT, and have we already lost that? And that's a question that I put back to you. Thanks.
I wanted to jump in on something you just said, because I think it's important, the notion of AI is a transformative technology, and it's there and it's causing problems, but it's almost more exacerbating a problem that already exists, right? Like you said, you've been tracking cybersecurity threats and disinformation threats, and I said earlier, hybrid threats. Like we actually have two groups at Microsoft. One is called the Threat Intelligence Center that tracks your APTs that everybody knows, right? They're like 28, 29, the Russians. But we also start tracking APMs. We call it Advanced Persistent Manipulators. So we do the same exact thing. We give them a classification, we associate them with the nation state, and we say, these are the information operations that they are running against elections, against other society. At the Threat Analysis Center, they just put out a report earlier this week about Russian operations against the Paris Olympics. Suggested reading. Because it's scary, right? You read that and you go, oh no, they're going to do the same thing to the elections, and the answer is, yeah, they are, right? But I do think it's important to say, like, they are the same thing, and one thing that everybody should consider in this room is that the bad guys have had access to a lot of this technology for a really long time. And I think in cybersecurity, we've seen that. I mean, it's kind of a scary, like, AI-assisted hacking is a growing threat. AI-assisted fin crime, things like that, I think is probably going to be the next 10 years of our lives. But the framing is like, just because all of us got access to ChatGPT a year ago, the bad guys have had this stuff for 10 years. And when we look at disinformation campaigns and stuff like that, they've been active and using these technologies for a while. So we're playing a little bit of a catch-up game, I think, as a society, the societal awareness piece of it.
If it's all hands on deck, then I was wondering how your sectors work with each other. Maybe you can give any examples you're allowed to give, at least, of working, with industry, with government, government with industry, and where that works. How should it work? Best practices. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. So Cyber Center works very closely with Microsoft as well as many other tech companies around the world. A lot of this is at the technical level, so we're sharing TTPs, so sort of cyber signatures of bad activity, spear phishing, malware campaigns, this kind of thing. And so that happens regularly at an enormous scale. It's highly productive and useful because the idea with cybersecurity is that it's defense, and it is, if your defense is good but your neighbor's defense is bad, it doesn't matter. You're still getting hit one way or the other. So sharing this information is really useful. So at a technical level, it works really well. But once you get to I think the level that the audience is most interested in, I think it's still baby steps, right? It is, public servants are obviously motivated by, certainly my agency is motivated by the national security of Canada. And so we work closely with our Five Eyes partners internationally. But this is the first time I've met Dave, for instance, and so now we're friends, so we can talk about this going forward. Yeah.
I mean, and that the public-private partnership thing aspect here, right? Government and industry working together, we have to. I know that Mystic, which is our cyber team, and TAG at Google, their threat analysis group, we share lots and lots and lots of data with the Five Eyes, and it's for good reason. Like, all of that activity happens over the systems of about 4 different companies, right? And so we have an obligation to provide those indicators of compromise and talk about what we're seeing with government, because that's how we keep all of you safe. I think there's a little bit of a, it's an unfortunate aspect of the way everything is set up, is that sometimes we tend to put the burden of cybersecurity onto the end user. And I'll cop to Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon. We're all bad about it to some extent, but it really can't be, right? It has to be us keeping you guys safe, because most people don't have that knowledge level. They don't have that ability to keep themselves safe from, especially when it comes to, we're talking about elections and foreign adversaries. Like, we always talk about. Imagine if a sheriff in some remote part of Ontario was going to stand alone against a Russian invasion of tanks. Like, could you even imagine? Like, what's he going to do? But that's kind of what it's like right now, right? Russians are invading our elections, and it's up to us to keep them away. It shouldn't be up to you.
I'll bring up something that I think, Dave, you'd mentioned about trust, this issue of trust in elections, especially among the general population and civil society. And so you'd mentioned this balance between, when it is warranted, we want there to be a high level of trust in our elections, but sometimes that's not warranted. And it's important for elections not to be trusted so that you can push through changes where instances happen, maybe less of an instance that always would be happening in Canada, but we see this in other countries where there's low trust in elections for really good reasons, right? So there's this balance between, we want to promote trust, but also we don't want to just sweep things under the rug as well. So how do we navigate that challenge then of trust building? And especially in a potential election, well, definitely election year in some provinces, possibly, who knows, federally. What should we and what are you doing to build trust where it is warranted and address the issues where trust isn't there but really isn't warranted? Yeah. Dave, go for it.
Yeah, so, building trust comes lots of ways, but I think one thing that is on everyone's mind right now is societal resilience to AI-enabled disinformation, right? That's probably what you thought we were going to talk about here today, so we should talk about it. This is a really complex problem. I like to compare it to climate change, right? Climate change has no one solution. We can reduce carbon emissions, we can all recycle, we can stand up different alternative energy sources, we can change our light bulbs. No one thing of that is the solution to climate change. All of those things are the solution to climate change, right? And so when we look at how to prevent AI from becoming a weapon, we have to take a similar approach. Like, okay, what are the various things we are doing to build trust as a society? I think there's some really promising new technologies. We can dive into content provenance if you want, but that's a whole thing. We can imagine if I had the ability to tell you that this image came from you. Like that's what content provenance is. That's cool, right? Because the BBC has started using it on their investigative reporting. So when they take in a video, you know it came from the BBC. It's actually stamped into indelibly stamped into the video. It cannot be removed cryptographically. So that's cool. There's watermarking, the same way you have like, the blue check mark used to be on Twitter, right? But some trust indicator of verification, like this is who they say they are, that goes along with content provenance. There's cybersecurity, right? There's building, knowing that the security is there and not being infiltrated. There's societal awareness, so taking the pieces of like, okay, why does MTAC at Microsoft put out these reports, like on Russia and Paris, the Paris Olympics? It's because we need everyone to know it's happening. Because you need to know that's happening in order to come around to the mindset of, maybe I shouldn't believe everything I see about the Olympics. And then that gets to the last point, which is just, no one wants to hear this. There's no quick solution to a lot of this stuff. There was a 20-year media literacy education project that needs to happen worldwide, partly to fix how badly we failed at social media, but as AI is going to exacerbate that, we need to take it even more seriously. We need to start training children how to consume media responsibly, how to spot AI, how to know when it's synthetically generated content is disingenuous, how to look for trust indicators and build sources. When we used to, on Microsoft properties in the US, when we do voter registration and voter information, we used to point them to a nonprofit. It was, Democracy Works, which is really well-known, well-trusted. Don't want to say anything bad about them. But we've started this cycle pushing folks to official government websites like the Electoral Commissions. And that's because we want to build trust indicators, right? We want people to start seeing the electoral commissions, you guys in the room, as the authoritative sources. And if that means I don't get to track how many voter registrations I'm responsible for, so be it. It's more important that we're building trust indicators, right? And sending people that way. So I think that's all of those things together, like help build the mental capacity for trust indicators. That's really important.
That's really interesting. Josh, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, sure. I think, from my perspective, trust is information. And so to the degree that we can tell Canadians, tell our stakeholders, tell our partners what we're seeing, do so transparently, and if they need help with the technical stuff, help explain that. I think that goes a long way. And so I'll just give a couple examples recently that the Cyber Center's done. So number one, the Cyber Center has a huge outreach effort, forming partnerships. So in the democratic institution space, it's done collaboratively with Elections Canada, but we have relationships with the electoral management bodies. We've brought them, provincial management bodies, we've brought them in. We publish, threats to democratic process. And we also just yesterday posted a report on warning provinces, territories, municipal governments, and critical infrastructure in Canada about the threat from PRC from China, cyber espionage and pre-positioning for computer network attack. This is an expression of us saying we are really worried about this and we don't want to sit on this information. We want to explain this to Canadians. And so, trust in institutions is not defined or decided by what happens today or tomorrow. It's 150 some odd years of knowledge and trust of that institution that is built up. And so when it's under threat, you withdraw from that bank of trust. But to the extent that we can contribute to depositing trust into that bank, I think from our perspective, it comes a lot from just sharing what we know in plain English and allowing everyone to sort of absorb that and move on.
And you think that the items, for example, the reports and things, will eventually filter down into people who maybe aren't reading the full report, but, you know, we had that panel this morning on local media and such. That challenge of getting that barrier between where you are and what you're writing to the average citizen who is not reading reports. I think that might also be a part of that issue that needs to get addressed, and that was this morning's panel to deal with. Yeah. We do have to have some time for questions there's just two more things I wanted to talk about. One is whether you had any thoughts on the global context and had anything else you wanted to talk about what's going on in the world and how that affects us in Canada. Maybe we'll start with Dave, just because you are outside of Canada. Yeah.
Well, and just for bigger context, I think I slept like 3 or 4 hours last night because this week is insane. I don't know if you guys know this, but I guess you probably do. This is an elections conference. Everyone knows this. Last week was, we went from South Africa into Mexico, and then India did their readout on Tuesday, and the EU starts tomorrow. So I think between those 4 elections, that's like 2 billion people or something insane. I mean, India alone has almost 1 billion registered voters. Like, this is an insane time of voting. So I'm glad for it, because it's getting everybody to pay attention to these issues. We're not actually seeing a lot of like AI and deepfake interference in elections right now. Now, I say that with a big caveat. At the top level, we're not seeing it. We have limited ability to analyze some of these. The Semaphore is doing a good job tracking it, rest of world, Berkeley lab, Hani Farid. They're all doing a good job. I'd recommend you go out. They all keep track of like deepfakes and how many deepfakes per election and all these things. We saw a lot of deepfakes in Mexico and in India, but we don't think they affected the like top level result of the election. But they may have affected the bottom level result of the election, right? Like the down ballot races. And we really don't know. And so we're looking toward, well, the US is going to vote in November, and Canada is probably going to vote sometime next year. We don't know when. So these are the bellwethers that we're looking at right now to see how it's affecting things. So I think a lot of research needs to happen between now and November to figure out how some of this down ballot stuff shook out. It's really interesting in India, where we keep seeing like just a plethora of deepfakes being shared around, and they're not fooling anyone. It's entertainment. It's not like influence operations. It's not the Russians doing it. People are doing it for fun, because it's fun to deepfake Bollywood folks endorsing politicians. And so there's something there that we haven't quite figured out.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple signals that I put in your heads to consider for what it's worth. First one is, to Dave's point, the U.S. election in November. That's the Super Bowl of elections. And so we are going to see the new tools that are available to threat actors and how they're going to deploy them in an innovative way. You can do only so much with red teaming. It's not until the actual event happens we're going to see what China, Russia, domestic actors, and whoever wants to use this technology to upset or just discredit the U.S. election. So that's something that we're definitely looking at. And then the second signal is a simple one, and it's mentioned in our Threats to Democratic Process version 4 that came out in November, which is as bilateral relations between Canada and various countries decline, for whatever reason, it could just be, a little upset. If that happens and it coincides with the election itself, with the federal election, then we'll very likely see those countries try and influence the election. So that's not necessarily a long-term strategic point of view to say we are going to ruin Canadian democracy or we are going to pick this leader or this party over that party. It is simply them using cyber as a means to extend and advance their foreign policy goals. But we will bear the brunt of that. So those are a couple of signals maybe to consider. You want to jump in there?
I wanted to jump in and just say, like, we've been a real downer up here, and I apologize. And I do want to flag something because I think it's interesting, like, again, the tools and weapons conversation, right? Like, we have a tendency to fixate on, like, what's the most awful use of AI that I can possibly think of? You know what's a really cool use of AI? Authorized soft fakes, right? So soft fake means a fake that was done with consent and permission. An example of that being Imran Khan running for Pakistan Prime Minister from prison. You know, this dude is probably totally a political prisoner, but he was given the ability to run from prison and make his voice heard at rallies and things like that by use of AI. And that's kind of cool, right? And actually technically won the election, but is not prime minister, so I don't know. But it's like there are good, cool uses of AI going on right now. In elections administration, I want you to think about that. Like International IDEA put out a report a few weeks ago that details all the different ways that elections commissions can use AI for back office stuff and for like cleaning voter rolls and things like that, and just like for making it easier for citizens to interact with government. And that's cool. And that's what we should, like, I really want to focus on that stuff. Like,
That's great, because it brings it right back to the first question of that balance of threats and opportunities. I do have more questions, but I know that there are questions from the floor and also from the Slido. Sorry, I couldn't remember. Do you want to maybe give a question from the Slido first, Helen? And then I think you'll have a microphone to move around. Perfect. So there are some hands, so maybe if you could get ready, that'd be great.
Awesome. So the first question is about the Alberta government's removal of the ability to use tabulators in their elections. How do you think that this will affect public trust in technology in elections?
Okay. Tabulators? Yeah. So the idea here being like trialing and saying, actually, no, we prefer not to? Is that the issue? I feel like the people we want to ask that question about are not necessarily. Oh, unless Dave has something.
clarifying
to say.
question, is Alberta hand counting? Is that the idea? Or
Yes.
you guys know that's nuts. I just like your elections, your
just wait
elections
till-
practitioners, like hand counting leads to more mistakes. I get
Wait
it.
till I tell you how we do it at the federal level.
Yeah, I know. There's a bunch of municipalities in the United States that are having the same debate too, and they're trying, like Nevada's trying to go back to hand counting, and they did it. They did a big test of it in the last election, and they discovered that it was not as good as tabulating.
Yeah, it's the threats and opportunities issue, right? Because once you kind of mention a machine is doing something, it turns into a black box, but I trust the person who's there. Yeah, no, it's sorry, I'm just looking right at the chief electoral officer, me like, do you just want the mic? No. Legitimately? Here.
So this is the point where we go into politics and perceptions. That's fine. So, I mean, for us, as in Alberta, I've been in parliamentary committees where they tell me, if you ever bring so much as a calculator in a polling station, we will legislate against it. So the discussion is only about, what part of no don't you understand? And it's not about the risks and the pros of using tabulation. It's just a no-fly zone for us federally. It's politics.
There we go. Yeah, so not necessarily always such rationally thought out discussions like we're having here, obviously.
I think we've gotten to a good place in most U.S. states that do tabulator, that we now have, like, at least risk limiting audits on, we keep all there are paper artifacts for everything that goes into the tabulator, and there are audits performed on those, and that should be enough for most people to trust the system, but politics, like you said. They get it.
Okay, so we have a question from the floor.
Yeah,
If you just introduce yourself.
yeah, I'm Daniel Stockmar. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. And I want to come back to what you said at the beginning. I mean, what's very important is that people have trust in elections. And I think when we talk about disinformation, misinformation, election interference, it's more the fear that there was some type of interference because people don't know the degree there was, if there was, and then they have like a commission, and there's a report coming up, any country, and it says there might have been, it was like this. So I think the problem is maybe not the actual interference, the point is that people don't know how safe their election still is, and that makes them very eerie. And I think that's something maybe you want to address, because for me it's more like, we don't know. I mean, voters feel they don't know. And then anytime there's a report, the report is inconclusive. So I think that's something maybe to address too, this perception or this insecurity.
And I think a lot of that is also, for us who don't have the special security clearance type things, we do have to trust that the institutions are telling us, are being transparent about what sort of issues are out there. But at the same time, you have that balance of too much information can sometimes not be the right move. So do you guys have any further thoughts on that issue of transparency and trust?
I wish Michael Wernick were here. I don't see him, but because he's, as a former clerk, was in that role. But I will say, in a general sense, my experience doing what I do for as long as I've done it is, it's all gray. There's very rarely is there a black and white day or a black and white fact, and to the degree that you get back to your fundamentals as a public servant, which is you literally serve the public. You have a duty to report on threats, and that gets out there. We do that every day. The question that, sir, you bring up, I think, is one that is, I would refer back to some of the panels earlier today talking about polling and public opinion on things, because public opinion can be this way, but that doesn't necessarily make that fact, right? That's just how people feel versus the reality. And so there's definitely an element of that, which is why this question of trust is core to this discussion today, and we've kind of moved around it in different ways. From a technology perspective, it is, as I said at the beginning, you can't mitigate risk to zero. There is some risk that is accepted. Cybersecurity, Cyber Center, we're good at what we do. We protect the government of Canada systems really well. We still get hacked. We still get compromised. It's about resiliency at that point as well. So there's an education component, there's sort of like speaking truth to power component, and then there's also making sure that the institutions have a plan, they can respond to this, they can communicate that effectively publicly. So I think there's a bunch of different aspects to it.
Yeah, okay. We have time for a question over here. Perfect. And then I see two hands here, but I'm not sure we're going to have time for it. So maybe I could just get Helen and friends to give us a time check on things. Yeah, go for it.
Hello. It's nice to see you again. I've never met you, Dave, but I've met Josh and Holly Ann before. So my question is around, how do you actually measure the impact of AI-generated deepfakes or misinformation on an election? I work in Democratic Institutions Research Integration Team, and this has been a problem that we've been working through for, well, at least since I started, which was a year ago. Like you said, a lot of the research in academia is based on people self-reporting kind of how they feel things are impacting them, people self-reporting how they feel misinformation might have shifted their opinions on certain issues, but whether or not that actually impacts the way that they vote is still kind of, it's difficult to measure because of the way that people vote. It's a secret, you don't have to disclose, that sort of thing. So just thinking kind of really practically, if the panel of 5 has to assess whether or not a threat that Josh, your team, might bring to them during an election period, and they have to think about, well, how do we know if we need to make an announcement that this has impacted the election? How do we measure those kinds of things?
Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, well, nice to see you, first of all. Yeah, I agree. Let me just say that, my response does not necessarily reflect my organization. This is my own opinion, but I think there's a great difficulty with trying to make a decision in a short amount of time, because to your point, you don't know, you can poll voter intention, you don't know how they voted, and the information environment is fluid. Tech companies probably have a better sense, the social media companies probably have a better sense of what content was delivered to that one person, which is different from the other person in their own content bubble. And so putting it together is really quite a challenge. I can reflect back on the 2016 US presidential election, which was really like a sea change for all of us in sort of understanding this. It was not until months after, and I would say probably years after, that we now can tell that story about what happened. So the expectation that you would have a clear-eyed understanding of voter intention right after an election is a very challenging question indeed.
Okay, we also had one final question. Someone had their hand up over here quite eagerly. So yeah, please.
Thank you, and I'll make it quick, bearing in mind we're almost out of time. So thank you for your comments and insights. I feel like rooms like ours really need to hear more of this. I know we're here to talk about electoral trust, but I wanted to zoom out on the trust gap a little bit more broadly, if that's okay. So the findings of the 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer were really surprising to me in the respect that corporations are seen as the institutions with the highest levels of trust. And then the Aligning Innovation Report really talked about the huge trust gap Canadians are facing, especially when it comes to AI. So many of us here are either not-for-profit leaders or public sector workers, and we face particular challenges around sectoral inequities, the not-for-profit sector lags in the resources, the human capital, and the hard technical skills, and so we lag as a result. So I'm just wondering what advice you have for community and not-for-profit leaders and how we can be leveraged when it comes to democratizing this technology as knowledge translators and educators. And also, what roles can corporations play in building trust and innovation so the general population, whether it be voters or workers or anyone across the spectrum, can meet this moment? Thank you.
Yeah, I
Go
love
for
that
it,
question.
yeah.
I love that question. Thank you. First, before I answer, I just want to say thank you to the Canadian Vote, so to the Exchange and TMU, and to Holly Ann and Josh. It's a great panel. There's two things here, right? One is trust can be loaned, right? Trust is transitive, or maybe whatever that mathematical property is. If corporations are trusted, we can then lend that trust to other entities, right? Like, we can use our power, and I mentioned this before, to build up elections commissions as trusted sources in the information that they provide. And that's great. Like, that's a thing we can do. Like you said, we're trusted entities. We can use that trust and loan that trust out, right? There's an interesting dynamic in today's society where most people, this is especially acute in the United States, where there was a real gap in like civics education from about, let's say, 20 years ago. And so people in their like 30s and 40s didn't get good civics education. And there's a lot of like, that's actually pretty widely true in the developed world, right? So the EU, the Five Eyes, like here in Canada. And so you ask yourself, where do those people go all day? The answer is work. They're at work. And a lot of them work for big companies, right? And so in as much as we are trusted entities, we have a duty, and this is one program that I run internally at Microsoft, to build trust in institutions with our own employee base, right? To build trust in elections with our own employee base. We try and educate our employees on civics. We try and educate our employees on voting. We just sent an email to all EU employees yesterday telling them, where to go for voting information. Hey, go use your vote this weekend. Like, it's important. Europe is important. We did the same in India a few weeks ago. We'll do the same in the United States. We'll do the same in the UK and hopefully in Canada. That's important, right? And we have all sorts of civic engagement programs internally to help that. And I work with a conglomerate of worldwide companies called the Civic Alliance to enable companies to do exactly that, to help their employees build civic engagement muscles.
Fantastic. Okay, because we started a little late, I am going to ask one last question. Sorry, John. I promised you guys I would ask this. Okay, so last year, AI was brand new, and now we're all talking AI. Everyone wanted to talk AI. What are we not talking about yet that you think next year when we come back to this summit is the technology that we need to be focusing on?
Content provenance.
Okay.
I mentioned it before, but
Yeah.
I think content provenance is going to be really big, especially with elections commissions. And I'll say we've been working with a few in the U.S. on, you can imagine like where you do use tabulators, you have artifacts that are cast vote records, right? And a lot of states that have them require publishing them online. Imagine if they are stamped with a cryptographic source so that these cast vote records came from the Arizona Secretary of State, right? That is powerful and that is necessary. And I think that's going to be a big deal in the next year.
Josh, what's your answer?
All right, well, asking me to be optimistic is tough because my job is threat
You don't have to
assessment.
be optimistic.
But, so I think artificial intelligence, like generative AI is something that has not been absorbed into like society's collective consciousness. My mom has read about generative AI, but I guarantee you she doesn't have a ChatGPT account. She doesn't use that. And it's not, maybe a year from now, they will have got that. It's like, remember when Facebook came out and it was like all the kids were on it and it was cool, and now no one's on Facebook, it's just like older people, right? We have to get to that sort of, 85% market penetration for generative AI tools, at which point we'll understand this technology and we'll probably be at the end of this paradigm shift. So I know you said don't say generative AI, but I'm just saying, from my perspective, next year we will have a better sense of workforce reductions, like what is being used how is generative AI being used to reshape our economy, at which point we'll probably be in a better sense of okay, this is what we need to be worried about.
Okay, thank you. So John, this is what we're going to talk about next year. Already got a panel done and ready to go. Thank you so much to our two panel members, Dave and Josh. And
thank you, Holly Ann, for, again, I do feel like these are incredibly complex topics. There was definitely terminology used here that I do not fully understand, but I think that there are a lot of folks in the room who do. We have our work cut out for us, and that there are going to be follow-up conversations. There are going to be connections that are made. I heard all of our provincial election folks, our municipal election folks, I heard an offer for conversation to continue this. That is critical to addressing these really quickly emerging challenges. Though I get to now just do a couple of housekeeping things before turning it over to a couple of folks who've been with us and who've been allies and friends of the exchange to sort of give us a quick wrap up on the day before we wrap this portion of the summit. So tonight we have a keynote by David Frum and Susan Delacourt, who will be leading that conversation with David. That is in a different venue. That is at Daniel's Spectrum. You should all have information about how to get there. If you don't, talk to staff and ask, but it's straight down Dundas Square. There's the streetcar that goes right out front here that will get you there, or you can hop in an Uber, get a food post. It's 5 minutes down the block, but you might be, so we have a reception before the talk. The talk starts at 7 o'clock. The reception begins at 6. So we'll hope to see you there. If you don't join us tonight, then we'll see you back here tomorrow morning for another day much more workshop-oriented, much more hands-on. Today was a lot of our, great thinking, but tomorrow is again solution-focused about how we can address these bigger challenges. So we'll see you back here in the morning. Anything else I'm looking at my staff, folks, questions that things I'm forgetting to say? Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, and all of you, of course, the most important thing, we started today with, you get chocolate bars. Who doesn't like chocolate? The most, we have to remember critical life fun things. And they come to us, we got them from our friends and amazing organization called Peace by Chocolate. If you're not familiar with their work, you should totally check them out. There's an amazing, fun, inspiring documentary. Talk about building community. This is a great Canadian story about building community through chocolate, which we all love. A Syrian refugee who's a chocolatier in Syria who has arrived here in East and doing amazing work. So I encourage you all to check that out. Share the chocolate, enjoy the chocolate, and participate and build community through food, because who doesn't do that? So it's something we could all agree on here. All right, I'd like to call up Victoria and Rob Goodman, Victoria Kukits. So I'm gonna, I guess I will start, Victoria's closer, so you get to begin our closing, but Victoria has been a great ally and friend of the Exchange before its inception, and Victoria is also our host for Democracy Dialogues, which many of you have tuned into, but it's our regular series of conversations about the critical issues facing. This is another way we continue this conversation, and Dr. Goodman, Rob Goodman, is a professor here at TMU and another ally and somebody who has recently arrived in Canada, relatively recent, more recently than me, but has written an incredibly insightful book about the challenges that we face and the strengths of Canada's democracy, and especially as it relates to comparison to the US. If you haven't checked out his book, Not Here, I'd highly encourage you to do that, because actually, I think you will take a lot of optimism away from that book. But turn it over to you, Victoria.
Thanks very much, John. And I want to ditto John's comments on Rob's book. I actually consider it my read of the year. So really encourage all of you to read it. It's actually so insightful and a delightful read too. But to the matter at hand, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victoria. I feel like I know many of you in the room already and call you friends, but if not, I'm so excited to meet you and continue the conversations from today. I'm also really pleased to be a representative of the advisory council who worked with John and Kat and the amazing people at the Exchange to bring you the Canadian Vote Summit. So what we heard today from the data, the storytelling, the research, the expert testimonials, is that healthy communities make for healthy democracies. But we do face immense social fracture right here in this city and around the world. People are dealing with deep economic injustice, fear of erasure, loneliness, anger, resentment, and a whole host of challenges that make us feel heartache, exasperation, but I don't think there's that much apathy in this room, but that's something that we face more broadly. So today across all the panels, we asked ourselves big questions like, what is the best way for politics and politicians to serve people in 2024? How can local democracy be scaled for grassroots momentum to influence power in politics? What is this project called Canada? Do we have a sense of shared values? Did we ever? If so, what are they? Can we write a new narrative that somehow brings together this mosaic of experience towards a vision of Canada? In terms of the community builders in the room, what does solidarity look like in 2024? And how and when should we come together at work, in public squares, and beyond? What about bad actors and divisive tech? Can we innovate responsibly? I think we just saw a pretty amazing example of how Microsoft is walking that path. Will we be ripped apart by those stoking polarization? Or can we actually have arguments and remain friends? Can we be receptive to one another's pain? Can we give each other some level of psychological safety in the spirit of trying to connect with each other more? Well, I think those answers are actually found here in this room and in community, and the communities that you serve as well. So I urge you, and I know actually that you will, to please take these conversations back to your families, neighbors, colleagues, and to your broader communities and empower them to really provide the solutions. Because when we connect like this, in person, face to face, I'm using a screen, but ideally without screens, then I think there is the promise and the potential around the challenges we're facing, remembering ultimately that our well-being is interdependent. As Sharon Avery said earlier, the more neighbors you know by name, the higher your quality of life. I think that's a simple but a powerful challenge for all of us to take on. And then finally, just a couple thank yous. So thank you to the committed community we see here in this room. Though I am an optimist, even I've been questioning the times that we're in and how we can move forward. My own reserves feel much fuller this evening after connecting with all of you and hearing about your own interventions in the hard and long work of democracy building. Thank you to the speakers and thinkers today. A heartfelt thank you to my fellow advisory members. Our hard work over the past few months has powerfully manifested in this room today. And most importantly, I'd really like to acknowledge and thank John and Kat, who are a mighty but extraordinary team. They're both visionaries and committed leaders who brought this conference together and have their sleeves rolled up each and every single day. John and Kat, we are grateful and proud to call you our friends and our co-conspirators in this work. Will you please join me in thanking them with a round of applause? Rob, would you like to come up and offer your closing comments?
Well, thanks so much. I'm going to apologize in advance for getting political at the politics conference. As John mentioned, I wrote a book called Not Here about what's going on in our neighboring democracy and what it might mean for democracy in Canada. And because that's what I know the most about, that's what I'm mainly going to talk about very briefly at the end of our day's session. When we write or talk about politics, we aren't just trying to describe the world. We're trying to make something happen in the world. So when I encounter an important claim about politics, like the claim that democracy is in crisis, I don't think it's enough to ask what it means or what it says. We also have to ask, what is it trying to do? What is it trying to make happen in the world? If we use Donald Trump's infamous ride down the escalator in 2015 as a convenient starting point, the democracy in crisis talk is now almost a decade old. It is a cottage industry, and I've perpetrated a democracy in crisis book too. So at a certain point, it is fair to take stock and ask, what are we trying to do with the idea that democracy is in crisis? I think it's also fair to point out that we are not all trying to do the same thing. For some of us, the idea that democracy is in crisis means that authoritarianism, or even fascism, is one election away. We know that Donald Trump led a conspiracy to overturn the last American presidential election, that the American constitutional and legal systems have not held him accountable, yet, I hope, and that he is now the betting favorite to return to power. We know what he has promised us: mass deportations, a weaponized federal bureaucracy, friendship with autocrats from Putin to Netanyahu to Orban. We know that he has promised, in his own words, retribution. And if this is how we understand and define the crisis of democracy, then it is right and fitting to subordinate every other political goal to preventing that worst-case scenario, that extinction-level event, in the words of one pundit. We might be inclined to criticize our leaders, but don't we understand what they are keeping at bay for us? Don't we understand how far we have to fall? The worse the incipient crisis, the more forgiving we ought to be. So there is a version of democracy in crisis, and I'd call it by far the dominant version, among whose very important effects is this: it disciplines us as citizens. It effectively tells us to expect less of our leaders. If we identify the crisis with one person, or even with one party, then the more we ask of democracy in the present, the more we risk of democracy in the future. I'm reminded of the story that President Lincoln used when he wanted to shut up a group of abolitionists who came to lobby him at the White House. If you were watching a tightrope walker trying to carry your life savings across Niagara Falls, you wouldn't give him advice. Quote, you would hold your breath as well as your tongue. Keep silence, and we'll get you safe across. Hold your breath, as well as your tongue. Keep silence. It's good advice for watching a tightrope walker, but is it good advice for how to practice democracy? And is it an appropriate response, ever, to the scandal and the crime of human oppression? If our response is no, then there is another way of thinking and talking about the crisis of democracy. To the question, don't you know how bad it can get? It responds with another question. Isn't this bad enough? Consider the slaughter in Gaza that the American government has enabled, condoned, and helped finance. Whatever defines authoritarianism for you, its indifference to human life, its assault on human dignity, its bottomless contempt for equal human freedom, it is being visited on women and children right now with the American government's active support, and to be fair, with some faint noises of disapproval from up here in Canada. Is that not part of the crisis of democracy? Speaking for myself, the crisis has never primarily been about what happens to us. It is about the depths to which we are capable of sinking. When President Biden tells Americans that the soul of the nation is somehow at stake in the democratic crisis, that is the shared assumption he is speaking to. The powerful moral intuition that the evil we endure is never as grave a matter as the evil we inflict. President Biden had the wisdom to voice that moral intuition. I wish he had the fortitude to live up to it. Do our democracies have the fortitude to handle dissent? Does a healthy democracy meet dissent with tear gas and clubs? The SWAT teams that attacked the Palestine Solidarity encampments at Columbia or City College or UCLA or at the University of Calgary for that matter carried the same sorts of weapons and carried the same philosophy of militarized policing as the SWAT teams that met the George Floyd protests in 2020 or the Ferguson protests of 2014. Are those events not part of your crisis of democracy? If not, why not? Democracy may be on the ballot, but across those years, Americans cast many ballots, only to find just how deeply parts of the American system are insulated from democratic change. Democracy is on the ballot, but in the United States, the unambiguous candidate of democracy is also a willing accomplice to atrocities. Democracy is on the ballot, but next week the US Congress is going to bestow one of the highest honors it can give on Benjamin Netanyahu, a man under an arrest warrant for war crimes. And a letter inviting him to address a joint session is signed by 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, the leaders of both parties in both chambers. 2 enablers of January 6th and 2 Democrats whose objections to political violence turn out to be much more selective than we might have hoped. That is the perversity of this moment. A political system capable of producing such profound indifference to suffering is sick unto death. And if we mean our crisis talk, then I believe we need to bear witness to that sickness, rather than glossing it over with a simple, so you'd rather have Trump? As long as the authoritarian right is a viable force in the United States, or Canada, or anywhere else, voters will be asked to hold their tongues and compromise with profound wrongdoing, precisely because democracy is at stake. I think the only way out of this trap is to systematically dismantle the authoritarian right. And as far as I can tell, the only thing that has ever managed to accomplish that for long is a popular front, an alliance of small L liberals and the left to save democracy from fascism. I'm not describing a political deal geared to an upcoming election, but rather a shared generational project, one that recognizes the authoritarian right doesn't need to win a single election to warp and distort our politics. And so in the long run, democratic politics only really begins with whatever set of political, economic, and structural reforms it will take to make fascists irrelevant. So if we want to speak about democracy, it is good to speak about loneliness and social media and disinformation and the future of local news. But we also have to speak about power and coalition building and our solidarity with one another. What kind of popular front is broad enough to win? And at the same time, what kind of popular front has a broad enough vision of the crisis to win in a way that matters? The optimism I want to leave you with is my faith and hope that we can do both at the same time. I don't speak for anyone, but if I could speak for those who see the crisis in the way that I do, who see in the way in which it stretches from Ferguson to Rafah, I imagine they would say, we can't accept war crimes abroad as the price of democracy at home, because if we do, then our very reasons for loving democracy are refuted in the eyes of the world. And for those of us here in Canada, these events are not only a test of our democracy, but of our sense of ourselves. We like to believe that we have learned something from the long histories of genocide and displacement on these lands. Now would be a good time to show it. We like to believe that, as much as we are an ally of the United States, we conduct our own foreign policy. Now would be a good time to show it. We like to believe that a country built on compromise and patience can respond to dissent with something other than brute force. Now would be a good time to show it. Thank you.
So this is what makes our democracy rich, is having a range of views and perspectives on issues that are critical and important to all of us. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this conversation. We look forward to seeing you later tonight, if you can make it, and seeing you tomorrow as we continue this work of addressing these critical issues, building community together with a common purpose that is at the heart of our work, which is having a vibrant and inclusive democracy in Canada. So with that, we will see you all very soon, and have a great evening.